Alright, good morning, class 10A. Here we are. Again, we're going to discuss about the remaining portion of the brain. We have discussed about brain so far. We have discussed about different parts of the brain. The last thing that we discussed is the medulla oblongata. Today we are going to discuss about the spinal cord. The spinal cord is you can say, the continuation of the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, which is the last part of the brain, medulla oblongata, which is the last part of the brain. If this is the brain, this is the medulla oblongata. This medulla oblongata continues on the dorsal side of our body and it narrows down into a small conical structure at the lumbar region. This is what is known as the spinal cord. हाम्रो यहाँ पुच्छरे हड्डीसम्म यो एक्सटेन्ड भएर गएको हुन्छ. It is conical in shape and this is simply the extension of the medulla oblongata. So we can say spinal cord also happens to be the most important segment of the central nervous system. It connects the brain with the rest of the body. It continues down along the dorsal side. हामीले जुन चाहिँ ढाडको हड्डी भन्छौं त्यसको भित्र हुन्छ, inside the vertebral column, inside the backbone, that we commonly call it as the backbone. And this spinal cord controls the hunger and thirst, and it also carries out other basic functions like it controls the temperature of the body, it controls blood pressure and breathing as well. So the spinal cord is a narrow extension of the medulla oblongata which passes along the dorsal side of the body. It is made up of bundle of nerves. It is not a single nerve or a single structure. It is made up of number of nerves put together and it forms a cylindrical structure that narrows down at the lumbar region. It is made up of, the spinal cord is divided into segments. It is made up of altogether 31 segments. It is made up of 31 segments, out of which 8 is the cervical segments. The cervical segments are normally present in this particular region, in this particular region, okay, and there are 12 thoracic segments. After that, we have 5 lumbar segments. Lumbar segment is just below the thorax, just below the rib cage, just above the, slightly above the tailbone. That is called the lumbar segments. Then we have the 5 sacral segments which lie just above the coccygeal bone, and here the bones are fused together. The segments are 5 segments which is called the sacral segments, and the final one is called the coccygeal segment. So there are altogether 31 segments, and each of these 31 segments. Now, before that, I think we need to remember here that this spinal cord is not open. It is protected by vertebrae like this. Number of small bones put together which makes up the vertebrae. Like this. Number of bones piled on one top of the other, like this, called the vertebrae. This is called the vertebrae. And number of vertebrae are stacked one on top of the other, and it makes up a column. So the entire structure that protects the bony covering, that protects the spinal cord, is called the vertebral column is called the vertebral column. So, this 31 segments, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar and 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal. From each of these segments, nerves arise like this. Nerves arise like this on both the sides. And which makes up 31 pairs of nerves. 31 pairs of nerves. Through these segments, number of nerves arise. There are 31 pairs of nerves arising from each segment, which innervates the different organs, organ systems and the limbs of the body. So basically, the spinal cord supplies nerves. So the nerves that originate from the spinal cord are from these 31 segments are supplied to the different parts of the body. Alright? 31 pairs of nerves arise on both the sides. There are 31 pairs of nerves which innervate the different organs, the organ systems and different limbs of our body. So whatever message to the different parts of the body passes through the spinal cord and through these nerves and reaches the different regions, and whatever sensory information is to be carried to the brain is captured by the sensory neurons from the limbs or the organs, and it passes through the spinal cord and goes to the brain. This is about basically the position and the protection of the spinal cord that we have talked about, and here you need to remember it is protected by bony covering called the vertebral column, inside which there is a canal called the neural canal through which the spinal cord passes, and it is divided into these segments: 8 cervical, Chuko region, then 12 thoracic, Pichungo, then again 5 lumbar, Dhadko, then sacral, alikati lower Dhadko, only 1 coccygeal. Coccygeal comes from the word coccyx, which means the tailbone. Alright, so this is basically the structure of the spinal cord. Now let's get into the transverse section. If this is the spinal cord, if we take out a section like this section is called the transverse section. Now when you look at the transverse section of the spinal cord, it appears to be like this. It appears to be like this. We have the central canal here. Then what we have here is the horn-like structure present here. Horn-like structure present here. This is the structure of the spinal cord. This is the structure of the spinal cord. The interior, this horn-like structure that is present inside the spinal cord is filled with cell bodies. It is filled with cell bodies. That is why we have talked about this, when there is a large presence of cell bodies, what happens to this cerebral cortex. We have talked about the name that is given here is also called the grey matter, because here there is large presence of the cell bodies, and whatever thinking process that the spinal cord does, especially when it conducts the reflex action, is done with the help of this grey matter. And on the outside, nerve fibers, we have already talked about 31 pairs of nerves originate from it, and these are the place where only nerve fibers, the axons, are present. This is called the white matter. Here at the center is called the central canal, which is filled up with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. Now, we need to make an important observation here. That is, when we talked about the cerebrum, the grey matter was on the outside, on the cerebral cortex, and the white matter was inside when we talked about the cerebrum. Here it is just the reverse. The grey matter is inside the spinal cord and white matter is outside the spinal cord. This is just the reverse of what we have seen in the cerebrum. This central canal, which contains cerebrospinal fluid, is continuous with the stasis that is present inside the brain, about which we will be talking about a little later. So basically, the structure of the spinal cord in the transverse section, we have the grey matter at the center and white matter, and we have the central canal which is filled up with the cerebrospinal fluid. Before that, we have talked about there are 31 segments, and from these 31 segments originates the 31 pairs of nerves. We have the grey matter at the center and white matter, and we have the central canal which is filled up with the cerebrospinal fluid. Before that, we have talked about there are 31 segments, and from these 31 segments originates the 31 pairs of nerves. Now, let's talk about the function of the central spinal cord. The most important function is it is the center for the central for reflexes. Whatever reflex action. Now, what is this reflex action? Reflex action are sudden quick responses of the body. Like when you touch a hot plate, you remove your hand immediately. That is a quick response. If that response is not there, then your hands will get burnt. So that type of reflexes, which is quick, cannot take the time to send the message to the brain and again receive it. In this quick reactions that our body show, it is the spinal cord which controls. These quick reactions are what is known as reflexes. Another example we can talk about reflex action is something comes close to your eye, you automatically close your eyes without even knowing it. This type of reactions of the body, quick reactions, is what is known as the reflexes. The other important function of the brain, of the spinal cord, another important function of the spinal cord is it connects brain with the different parts of the body. The next function is connects brain with the, I'll just rub this out. We've already explained about this, with the other parts of the body. This is another important function, because whatever message has to be brought from the limbs passes through the spinal cord. Whatever message has to be sent by the central nervous system, that is the brain, it passes through the spinal cord. So that is why the spinal cord helps in connecting the different parts of the body to the brain. Third important function of the brain is it is the center for autonomic nervous system. We have already talked about autonomic nervous system when we talked about the autonomic nervous system works on their own. It is not under the control of the brain. They work basically with the help of two nerves, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerves, and they autonomously, that means without any interference from the brain and the spinal cord, they control the different parts of the body. But the spinal cord is again a center for the autonomic nervous system. So these are the different structures and parts of the spinal cord. We finished with this. Now let's move on to the next part, that is meninges and CSF. Meninges. Now, We already know that the brain is protected by a bony covering called the skull or the cranium from outside. But that isn't enough. The brain is a very delicate structure, so it further needs protection. So it is protected by a layer of 3 layers of membranes. 3 layers of membranes. These 3 layers of membranes are what are known as meninges. The meninges are besides the skull, below the skull, there are 3 layers of membranes called the meninges. Now, what are the 3 layers? Outer is called the dura mater. Middle layer is called the arachnoid, and the inner layer is called the pia mater. So these 3 are together known as the meninges. These 3 layers are called the meninges. Now, below the meninges, the brain is further protected by a fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. Below the meninges, there is a space which is filled up with this fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this fluid is not just below the meninges, it is also present inside the brain. Brain bhitra pani isko presence. To understand that, let's draw a diagram. A small diagram. Now, if you open up the cerebrum like this, the 2 cerebral hemispheres, if you open up, it looks like this. It looks like this, the 2 cerebral hemispheres. If you open up, it looks like this. These 2 cerebral hemispheres are joined together by the corpus callosum. This is the cerebrum, joined together by a membrane called corpus callosum. Now, at the region of the brainstem, there are 2 lateral spaces like this. 2 lateral spaces. These spaces are joined together and they unite together to form the 3rd space here. The 3rd space. These 2 laterals, ventricles. Spaces are called the ventricles. These lateral spaces inside the brain are called first and second ventricles. The first and the second ventricle. These 2 ventricles are open up into a 3rd space that is called the 3rd ventricle. The lateral ventricles open up into the 3rd space by a connection called the interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen. Now this 3rd ventricle further extends down and forms another space here. Another space here, which forms the 4th ventricle. At this particular region, we have the peduncle of the cerebrum like this. So basically, These spaces inside the brain, here I have drawn very small, they are slightly larger than this. The two lateral ventricles, 1 and 2, then we have the third ventricle. This third ventricle continues to form the fourth ventricle, and the duct that connects the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle is called aqueduct of Slivius. Aqueduct of Slivius. Just adjacent to this, the first and the second ventricle, there is one of the most important gland of our body called the thalamus. So this is basically the ventricles that is present inside the brain, and in these ventricles there it is filled up with a fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. This function of the CSF, it acts as the shock absorber. Now, a brain is a very delicate organ, that is why it needs to be protected very well. The skull protects it from outside, then we have the meninges, which is made up of 3 layers. Now, inside the brain, there are spaces called the ventricles. There are 4 ventricles inside the brain, which are filled up with the cerebrospinal fluid, and this cerebrospinal fluid acts as the shock absorber. Whenever you bang against something on your head, or you are hit by something on your head, it is the cerebrospinal fluid present in the ventricles which absorbs the shock and protects your brain, because brain is a very delicate organ. If anything happens, if any damage takes place to the brain, it could prove fatal. Now, there are a number of functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. The first and the foremost, it acts as the shock absorber. Second, it is a buffer zone. The cerebrospinal fluid is a buffer zone because it is here that all those electrolytes, ions, nutrients, oxygen is present, which makes a continuous supply to the neurons, the nerve cells that makes up the central nervous system. And the third and the important function, it drains all the metabolic waste product that is produced as a result of metabolism in the neurons, is drained into the cerebrospinal fluid, from where it is discharged out of the body. So these are the 3 important functions. Acts as a shock absorber, acts as a buffer zone where there are nutrients, ions, electrolytes present, which is important for the neurons to carry out their normal function. And third, it acts as the site where all the metabolic waste product is drained into, and it is from here it is thrown out from the central nervous system through the kidney and thrown out from the body. So this is about the spinal cord, the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid for today. We'll carry on in the next class with the reflex arc, reflex action in detail in the next class.